2004, there was a dream that was happening in a corporation that they determined to put under total lockdown silence, because no one in the world would know what was happening with the people there. They called it the Purple Project. And in this project, they hired about 1,000 people for this project. 1,000. Significant. It's affected every single one of us today, some positively and some negatively. So that was 2004, led by a team of people, all with one goal in mind: to come up with this thing that we all carry around today. 2007 was the first release of the iPhone. It wasn't that long ago, people. I mean, you remember the flip phone? You remember texting on that? That was awful. Do you remember the bag phone? How many remember the bag phone? Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah. I wish I would have kept my bag phone. I don't think it's worth anything yet, but... So this iPhone was designed as a smartphone designed to make our life better. It had the internet on it. You could make phone calls, you could text. And I'm what you call an early adopter on most things. And so for me, I had a smartphone before the iPhone came out. And it was a flip phone that the screen was this big. And I was able to download all my contacts, because as a pastor, when you're on the road, you need all the contacts of all the church. So if somebody calls you with an emergency, you can be there right away. You see the logic, right? Yeah. And so I bought that one. Man, that was awesome. And then the iPhone came out. I waited for the bugs to get fixed on that. So I'm a little hesitant. I want to let the early adopters, they're in line. I'm after them. Like, I wait a little bit until they figure out the kinks. Didn't see many kinks. iPhone 3G comes out, and here I am. I'm in line. I'm getting my iPhone 3G. Remember those days? Wow, that was a long time ago. It was much smaller than the one we have today. And then I upgraded to the 6S because, man, that was so much better. And now I forget which one I have, but it's another one, right? It was supposed to make life better. And in some ways, it has. Listen, if I want information, I can grab it instantly. Internet speeds have gone crazy in the past 10 years as far as how fast you can get information. You Google something, and you have 1 million things that you can select from on all these pages of information. And everyone's vying for attention on the first thing, on the first page, and it's fascinating. You can get connected with people better. Listen, while you're out running around, you don't have to worry about, like with my family, the way I grew up, I told my parents everywhere I was going. In my house, we all agreed, the children and everybody agreed, here's what we're going to do. We're going to download an app so we can track each other. So they know where I'm at, I know where they're at. It all works seamlessly well. It's not a trust issue. We're just like, hey, oh, cool, you're stopping in the grocery store. While you're there, get this, And it works really well, sort of. And so that's kind of where we are in connection with people. You have all these social media and all these other fun things that you can do on your iPhone. And I see I'm losing the attention of some because you're looking down at your iPhone. And that's the problem. Today's research shows, and Gabe, this is where I'm really trying to work with you. Last week, Jamie did a great job on preaching and Gabe was part of that message, and it was a great message, by the way, and Gabe, thanks. So if you see Gabe looking down, I'm going to... Anyway, so 2 weeks in a row, buddy, you get to be in here. If you don't know, if you're online, you don't know who Gabe is, he's our camera guy. He's awesome. And anyway... In some ways, I will say that this thing has made our life worse. Now, pause. I'm not going to be recommending by the end of the message that you throw out your smartphone. Okay? but I do have a really good point that I believe will be transformational to some, if not all of us. Today's research shows that the iLife, I'll call it the iLife because I don't want to just keep referring to the iPhone, because some of you have the lesser important phones, the Androids or whatever, that are just far less superior. And so I don't want to offend anybody. I don't want to be politically correct and stuff like that, but whatever. So where was I? The research shows that this iLife has caused a lot more stress than anticipated. It's caused a lot more anxiety. It's caused emotional and social problems. Our mental health research is showing, and this is 15 years into this experiment of the iLife, I'll call it. 15 years later, there's some significant research that's being done, not like just surface research and headline kind of things like fake news, but this is scholarly research that's being done, that there is a real concern over some of the things that the iLife is causing mentally, emotionally. In this book, I would highly recommend this book. It's called The Wisdom Pyramid by Brett McCracken. I'll refer to this a couple times in this message. And he says this in his heading. He talks about how this is just causing so many issues in our life. And by the way, I got this from Jerry Baum, who's in camp. So Jerry, if you're watching, hey buddy, have fun. They were praying for you. But he gave this to me. He says, awesome book, and it really is. And he says this in here. He says, too much of anything causes problems for our health. Agreed? Okay. This is as true of information we take in as it is of the foods we consume. The information bombardment we increasingly face, characterized by nonstop swiping, scrolling, viewing, listening, reading, texting, and multitasking from morning to night, is creating stress in our brains and contributing to rising levels of anxiety. Our brains are shockingly adaptable and resilient, but, listen to this, they have limits. Our brains have limits. It says this a little bit further. It says, today's frenetic information landscape is making our brains busier than ever. The information triage that our overburdened brains must constantly perform naturally drains huge amounts of energy. Constant multitasking also drains energy. Making a dinner reservation on Yelp between replying to mom's text, sending a work email, and watching a must-see video a friend just shared on Facebook within the span of 5 minutes. Think about that. You've done that, right? You're probably doing it now? Okay, hopefully not. This sort of extreme multitasking, notes neuroscientist Daniel Levitin, overstimulates and stresses our brains. In quotes by this neuroscientist, asking the brain to shift attention from one activity to another causes the prefrontal cortex of the, I'm going to say this wrong, striatum, to burn up oxygenated glucose, the same fuel they need to stay on task, and the kind of rapid continual shifting we do with multitasking causes the brain to burn through fuel so quickly that we feel exhausted and disoriented after even a short time. We've literally depleted the nutrients of our brain. This leads to compromises in both cognitive and physical performance. Among other things, repeated task switching leads to anxiety, which raises levels of stress hormone cortisol in the brain, which in turn can lead to aggressive and impulsive behavior. Have I stressed you out now just reading that? And he just says we burden ourselves with massive amounts of unnecessary and often troubling knowledge. When we physically get sick, we search WebMD to find answers, and usually one finds more to worry about. I did that yesterday. I cut my finger and it was swollen a little bit, and I'm like, man, should I go see a doctor? I'll just check WebMD. They know best. And so I pulled up WebMD, and I found out 5 different infections you could have on your finger. It made me terrified. So I went to 3 hospitals. I'm kidding. I found the easiest treatment and started there. And those that are doctors, they can look at my finger later. But anyway. But you follow me. You do the same thing too, don't you? Like, we're all in this together. Okay, maybe some of you don't look up your finger cut and say there's something really wrong with me. But we all do different things there. And I would say that we're exposed to so much global news, Can our brains really pull this in? Think about it. We're concerned about the rainforest that's getting burnt up down in South America. At the same time, we're concerned about the Middle East and all the unrest of the Palestinian and all the other stuff that's going on, as well as the pandemic that's affecting everyone, and the post-COVID, and this new variant to everything that's going on, as well as what they said about this politician, and they said about this politician, and this, this bombardment that's going on that literally we can do nothing about. Think about it. We sit here with all of this information, and it's bombarding us, and we have to have this intelligent conversation. And the younger you are, the more infatuated, in a sense, you are with some of the latest political things that are going on. You're getting way more intelligent on some of these things than some of the older people are, or I'll say informed, because you're able to rapidly get the information from multiple different sites, and you've figured out a way to do it. And it's fascinating. The younger generation has very broad views on, or very informed views on very specific things, politically and such. It's fascinating where they get it. It's just you're able to pick the iLife up and say, okay, I'm going to search. But can our brains really hold all of that together is the question. We're exposed to so much violence. I remember when the television, not came out because I'm not that old, but I remember when the television was becoming more and more of a thing, and I grew up in a country area where we didn't have cable ever, so I didn't know what MTV was. I just heard of it, so I'm kind of an 80s child there, and so during that time and later, I would hear preachers talk about how the television is desensitizing your mind. All the violence and all the thing that's talking about is desensitizing your mind. And I remember that back then, and the concern was you're watching, 8 to 10 to 14 hours worth of TV a week. Listen, on this thing, I got my notification this morning, as many of you do if you have the right phone, that as to how much screen time I had on an average every day. Yeah, Ginny, you're right. It's embarrassing. I won't even tell you what my average was this week. You follow me? Now, I was on the Bible on my screen too at times, so therefore I can justify some of it, okay? But I don't think it was enough. And my point that I'm making is this really good? What do we do with all this? I was watching the news. Let me go to this. He says this on page 40. He says, "Never has the devil's work been easier in the area of novelty obsession. We check our smartphones upwards of 200 times per day." By the way, pause. Can I challenge you not to check your smartphone, any social media, for the next 40 minutes till we finish here? That will be sheer torture for you. For some of you, not others. Others like, what? He says we check our smartphones up to 200 times per day, filling every open space in life with whatever new thing can be scrolled through, in line at Target, in our car at stoplights, at the dinner table, or on the toilet. Our phone is usually the first thing we look at in the morning, the last thing we look at before bed. Instead of being content with silence in the in-between moments of life, our fidgety fingers can't help but reach for the phone so we can do something, anything, to maximize the time. Yeah, many of us are there. So this is a really good book. I'm kind of digesting it slowly. Let me show you what Peter says about this. Believe it or not, Peter, one of the closest friends of Jesus, writes in the book of 2 Peter chapter 2 and helps us to see some of these things and really helps us to be aware of what we should do with this. So if you could turn there with me to 2 Peter chapter 2, we're going to start there, and then I have another text that we're going to jump to as a result of what he's talking about. But in 2 Peter chapter 2, Peter, very simply, in all of this chapter, and I'm jumping in the middle of the train of thought, he is observing a world that's gone wild over sin. A world that's gone wild over sin. Listen, think about the amount of things we see on the news and the amount of things we pull up in our iLife that refers to sinfulness. Murder, stealing, the wars, and all the things that are going on. Most of it is referring to some sort of sinfulness. And so Peter, he's just reflecting, and he's observing a world that's just gone wild over sin. In verse 12, we'll jump in there. It's kind of middle of his thought, but 2 weeks ago we covered the beginning of the chapter. Now I want to cover the middle, and then next week we'll cover the end of this chapter. He says, but these, all the people that are just consumed with sin, he says these are like irrational animals. They're like rabid animals, right? You can't even figure out which way they're going. They're all over the place. Creatures of instincts, born to be caught and destroyed, blaspheming about matters of which they are ignorant, will also be destroyed in their destruction. He calls them irrational animals. You can't even figure out, you can't rationally have a conversation with them. They're all over the place. He says they start this direction of destruction, and they are destroyed in their destruction as well. Man, I see this all the time, unfortunately, and you do too. I look at people that are addicted to different things, drugs and alcohol, and I watch very specifically with them awesome people that start to experiment in, and they go to have fun with. And next thing you know, they're down this path of they can't help themselves but to have more and get more and do whatever they got to do to get more. I've watched awesome kids grow up into their college and 20s and 30s that begin to steal from their parents in order to have enough to get their next fix. Like straight out of their wallet. Steal the jewelry out of their mom's jewelry or whatever, and steal things that the parents have to put locks in their own bedroom to keep out their child that they love. They're irrational. You have a conversation and they seem to be complicit to do one thing, and then next thing you know, they're not. And you're like, what? You're just destroying yourself. And you see this is almost common, unfortunately. And so Peter, 2,000 years ago, is speaking of similar things there as well. And I'm only picking on one thing, but we could pick on a lot of different things that lead us into a path of destruction. And we've seen it. Some of us, maybe you've been there and you've been rescued out of that. Man, praise God for how he works there. And listen, if you know someone that's there, keep praying and keep being diligent. But he says they're irrational. They get destroyed in their destruction. Verse 13, he says, suffering wrong as the wage for their wrongdoing. And that's what he's talking about in verse 12, the destroyed in their destruction. He says they count it pleasure to revel in the daytime. Most people, when they do the wrong things, they're doing it at nighttime, not out in the daytime. And that's what he's referring to. Most people, it's when no one can see you. But they've gotten so accustomed doing the wrong thing, they'll revel, they'll do the wrong things, they'll do whatever rebel-rousing they'll do, even in the daytime, in the broad daylight while everybody's watching. It's as if, he says then further, they flaunt their deception, reveling in their deception while they feast with you. They're around you, they're hanging out with you, and they just flaunt how deceived they are. Verse 14, they have eyes full of adultery. Full of adultery. Adultery is sexual sin outside of marriage. It's cheating on your spouse. Their eyes are full of adultery. Do you know, since the invention of the iLife, the porn addiction has gone through the roof? Think about this. This is just very recent statistic. 1 out of 5 mobile searches, 1 out of 5, 20% of mobile searches are for a porn site. Just digest that. For every 5 searches, 1 of them is for porn. And can I just say, if we think that the church is exempt from this, every statistic that I've read says the church is very near the same as people that are unchurched in regards to this. And it's not just with men, it's with women. It's everyone is affected by this in some way, shape, or form. It comes to you, and you don't want it, and you go to it when you shouldn't. The change has happened there that years ago, prior to the iLife, you had to go to a place to get something, and it took a lot of forethought and planning to get there. Today, your 12-year-old that has one of these devices can see one of those sites in less than 2 seconds. Their eyes, he says, their eyes are full of adultery. Do we have that today? Yeah. Yeah. He goes on further. He says in the middle of verse 14, they entice, and he says, insatiable for sin. Do you know that sin never satisfies? It doesn't. Remember 2 weeks ago I talked about a hole in our soul? And we look for things to fill that hole in our soul that is created only for God? But we look for other things. If I could just get a little bit more, and a little bit more, and a little bit more, and here's what happens. That does not fill the hole in our soul. So we become insatiable in that search for whatever it can be to find something other than God to fill that. And that's what he's talking about here. He says, it's insatiable for sin. They entice unsteady souls. They have hearts trained for greed, accursed children. They entice unsteady souls with their hearts. They're always greedy. And here's what they ask. Here's what they do. They say, how can I benefit from you? How can I benefit from you? That's their goal. What can I do to get from you? By the way, what's love? Love is, what can I do for you? How can I look out for you? Do you see what he's addressing? He's very simply addressing that this is a world or culture that's opposite of love. It's I'm looking out for myself. I want as many benefits for myself as possible. And if we're going to be really honest here, all of these temptations are real for probably every single person in this room. Some temptations are distinctly different in their approach that Satan has for us. But all of these things that we've mentioned, the temptation's always there. It's constantly bombarding us. It's always there. And so therefore we stop and we have to pay attention and say, okay, this is real. What do we do with it? So Peter's very simply in this whole text just warning them and saying, listen, beware of the false teacher. And he goes on further in saying this in verse 15, forsaking the right way, they've gone astray, they've gone away from God, and here's what they did. They have followed the way of Balaam. Who's Balaam? He's a pretty interesting individual. Balaam is referred to several times in the Bible. He goes all the way back to Numbers chapter 22, and we're going to jump in at Numbers chapter 22. If you want to turn there with me, feel free to do that. But Numbers chapter 22. So Peter's referring back to Balaam, and he says this about him. He says, Balaam, the son of Beor, who loved gain from wrongdoing, but he was rebuked for his own transgression. A speechless donkey spoke to him with human voice and restrained the prophet's madness. Fascinating story. Let's go back to it. Numbers chapter 22 is this whole story. It's Numbers chapter 22 through chapter 24. So it's a lengthy story about this guy, Balaam. Who's Balaam? Balaam is a person that lived in Moses and Joshua's time. So Moses, just to give you context, he had just led Israel out of Egypt. And in leading Israel out of Egypt, they get to the other side. The Ammonites, they decide they're going to make war with Israel. Israel is a defenseless kind of a country that's just kind of roaming. They don't have any walls. They live in tents. They don't have a military because they just kind of ran for their lives. And God destroyed Egypt as a process. And then they get to the other side, and they're just kind of open for anybody to destroy them. The Ammonites go pick a fight. They actually win. Moses says to Joshua, hey man, figure out an army and you got to do something. We got to fight. Okay, so Joshua does. They win. The king of Moab then, Balak, not Balaam, but Balak, the king of Moab, gets a little bit concerned. Because here's the Ammonites that just got defeated, and here's this crazy country, the Israelites that just came out of Egypt, and Egypt is a world power, and they essentially decimated Egypt in some weird way. Like, they got to go through this water, and the Egyptians didn't, and it just killed their army. It was weird, and we don't know how to explain this, but that happened, and then the Ammonites, and wow, this is weird. So what we need to do is we've got to figure out a way to get rid of the Israelites. Okay. Now, what we understand is God said about the Israelites, if you bless them, God will bless you. If you curse them, God will curse you. God very simply says that he has blessed Israel all the way through, still today. Now, that's a whole big context we can talk about some other time. But for the sake of where we are today, Balaam is not an Israelite, son of Beor. He's not an Israelite. He is a diviner by trade. A diviner is someone who attempts to predict the future events or reveal occult things by supernatural means from witchcraft. Okay? Today, we've got all kinds of things like this. We have palm readers, or fortune tellers, or your astrological things, and all this other stuff that you can look at today. And that's still a normal way of living for some people today. Well, Balaam was very well known in his time. He would be like a best-selling author in this. It would be like a Warren Buffett that you're asking him, what kind of stocks should I invest in? Or someone else that's very notable in certain things that you say, hey, listen, you've been writing a lot. People feature you on different interviews. You've got this amazing blog and all these other things. I want to get your perspective on this. I need your help in this. I want your blessing as we go forward. Well, that's who Balaam is. He's somebody that the world in Mesopotamia, they really consider him a person of respect and someone that they want on their team. So, Balak, the king of Moab, let's go back to him. Verse 1 all the way through, Balak decides, here's what I'm going to do. I want to get rid of Israel. So the best way to get rid of Israel, and Israel's much bigger than me, like I have small people, I got to protect my people, and I'm afraid of them, so here's what I'm going to do. I don't have a big enough army, so I'm going to hire Balaam. I know he costs a bit, but I don't care. I'll hire Balaam, and Balaam is going to put a curse on Israel. Good move. So hire this guy. He's going to put a curse on Israel, and then we'll go in and fight and kill him. Or they'll just kill themselves. We'll figure that out. But for now, let's go get Balaam. So he sends a bunch of people over in his team, says, hey, listen, go find Balaam. Ask him what his fee is, hire him, whatever you got to do, bring him over to this place where Israel is, and have him stand on the mountain and put a curse on Israel. Good plan? Sure, that's a great plan if you're Balak. So he does. Goes over to Balaam. Balaam, by the way, is not a God-honoring individual, not a God-fearing individual in the way that we would appreciate, but he does know who God is. Here's what we find. Verse 6 of chapter 22 says, so the elders of Moab and the elders of Midian departed, verse 6. I was at verse 7. It says, come now, curse this people for me, since they are too mighty for me. Perhaps I shall be able to defeat them and drive them from the land, for I know that he whom you bless is blessed, and he who you curse is cursed. What a great day. Find this guy. So the elders, they go in, they find Balaam, and they say, hey, listen, here's Balak's message. Here's what we need you to do. We know that you like money, and you're filthy rich, and like you're kind of the richest guy in the area. We don't care. Whatever it takes, we got to get this thing done. All right, cool. So Balaam says, stay here. I'm going to go back and get a word from the Lord. Now, this is interesting because the word from the Lord in verse 8 is speaking of the Lord and the Israelites were to refer to the Lord God, their God, the God of Abraham and Jacob and Isaac, their God, they would refer to God as Yahweh. This word is that word. So here Balaam is referring to that God with respect and knowing and knowledge of the God of Israel. So he goes and he says, okay, I'm going to go speak to God. And so however he kind of plans this out and he gets to where God is, and God comes and meets with him. And God came and says to him, who are these guys with you? And he says, well, they want to curse on Israel, don't know much, don't care about Israel, I just want to put a curse on them. And here's God's response back. Verse 12, God said to Balaam, you shall not go with them. You shall not curse the people, for they are blessed. Okay, two things. Don't go with them, and don't curse them, because they are blessed. You're wasting your time. These are my people. Okay. So what does Balaam do? He goes back, he reports back, and he says in verse 13, Balaam rose in the morning and said to the prince of Balak, go to your own land, for the Lord has refused to let me go with you. He really didn't track too well with exactly what God said. He didn't say they're blessed. He just said, look, God's just caused me to pause here. I can't really go with you. I've got to stay here a little bit longer. Well, what's he doing? Well, he's manipulating the circumstance to be able to get a little bit more money out of them. That's his game. Because Balaam is a control freak and thinks that, I'll be above God here and God will change his mind. I just got to have a couple more words with God. You ever do that? Like, God will change his mind. Just give me a little bit more time with God and he'll change his mind on this. So we go down a little bit further and we find that in verse 15, Balak finds out. They go back and they say to Balak, and Balak says, look, this got to get done. So they send Balak sends all the people and the princes back to Balaam and says, listen, we really need this done. So come on. And so he goes and meets with God again. And God, I believe in the way he's doing it. He says, okay, go with them. But only do what I tell you. What's he doing there? He's setting Balaam up for embarrassment, which he does, which is fascinating. So in the next few verses, Balaam then goes with, and it says that the anger of God is kindled against. He's angry with him for going. Why? Because what God says is what should be done, and he says from the very beginning, don't go with them, don't have any parts of this. You have to know these are my people. And so he goes with them, and the anger of the Lord is kindled against him. And so what does he do? Well, we need somebody to talk to Balaam. Who are you going to get to talk to Balaam? Well, he's riding on a donkey. Now, there's a lot of fun jokes I could say on this one, but I'm not. We're in church. So he's riding on a donkey, and he gets to a place where the Spirit of God is standing, and Balaam can't see it, but the donkey can. The Spirit of God is in the way, so the donkey goes to the right a little bit, goes off the road. Balaam gets mad at the donkey, is pulling him back on the road, and gets back to where he wants him to be, and he just stands there, and then Balaam's getting more angry. The Spirit of God is standing in the way still. And the donkey, who can see the Spirit of God, just read the text and you'll see this. The donkey who can see the Spirit of God, Balaam who can't, the donkey lays down. Good day or bad day if you're riding a donkey? Yeah, bad day. So he lays right down. So here's what happens. Balaam takes a stick and begins to beat him. Not a little bit. He's like, wham, wham, hits him the third time, and God moves the donkey to speak to Balaam. What a cool sight this would be. If I was just videotaping this from down the street a little bit, right? He's beating the donkey, and the donkey opens up his mouth and starts to talk to him and says, why are you hitting me? Haven't I served you well for all these years? What are you doing? What's Balaam do? What do you do if a donkey starts talking to you? Yeah, Joyce, you're right. Run. Like, this is an unusual situation. What does Balaam do when a donkey starts talking to him? He makes a conversation of it. Oh, good, I got company. So he starts talking back. He's like, man, you make me so mad. What are you doing? Why aren't you moving? If I had a sword, I would put it through you and kill you right now. What a funny conversation. And the donkey then responds and says, I can't move ahead as God won't leave me. And then God opens Balaam's eyes, and he sees the Spirit of God that's in the way. And God begins to speak to him and says, listen, here's the deal. You only speak what I'm going to have you speak. And so for the next couple of chapters, he does not allow for Balaam to put a curse on Israel. But he walks with Balaam and Balak to different places as they go, and they say, okay, now we can. Let's make all these sacrifices, and God's going to be on our side if we do this. And there's a lot of application to this whole story. Peter's application is simple. One, God takes care of his people. That's the whole text of 2 Peter chapter 2. God will take care of his godly people. We don't have to sit there and be afraid. And what if the ungodly take over? God will take care of the godly people. Does that mean we won't go through pain? No, that's not what that means. It means that God will be there with us as we go through pain. God will be there with us to rescue us from pain. However God works, God is not going to forsake us. He's not going to leave us, those who are following Christ. And that's comforting. And then the second thing we see as we look at Balaam, we see that all that Balaam tried to do didn't go anywhere, but we see the deception that began to creep in. Numbers chapter 25, here's what ultimately happened. This is the down the road story. So Balaam didn't work out, but here's what happened, and through conversation and such, here's how they worked. In chapter 25, verse 1, while Israel lived in Shittim, the people began to whore with the daughters of Moab. They invited the people to the sacrifices of their gods, and the people ate and bowed down to their gods. So Israel yoked himself with a Baal of Peor, and the anger of the Lord was kindled against Israel. Essentially, if you can't beat them, join them. If you can't beat them, get them to join us. And that's how Moab beat Israel. They said, here, let's just distract them. Let's pull them away a little bit, and a little bit more, and a little bit more, and a little bit more, and a little bit more. Because, very simply, there is a hole in our soul that is meant for God, and the deception is, but wait, you can fill it with someone or something else. I think we have a lot of teaching on our phones, in our iLife. I think we have a whole lot of Balaams that are pushing into our minds and hearts to really beat us down, to distract us, to pull us away from God. We see this all the time. And this is my concern. And I think, to be honest, I think we need a digital diet, like an intervention. Like with kids, you would look at the kids and you would say, you can't keep eating Snickers and Kit Kats. You need something nutritious. We'd agree. Sometimes this is filled with stuff that's just Snickers and Kit Kats. The algorithms that they set up on here, when you speak, listen, my son Connor and I were talking about watches the other day. Do you know what came up on all my feeds? Watches. Buy this watch, buy this Swiss watch, buy this Hamilton watch, buy this watch and this one. Why? The algorithms are set up to come and bombard our soul, even in the things we're curious about. So our slight curiosity, it drives in and says, come on, come get it. And it feeds in that hole in our soul and says, oh, you'll feel better if you get this Swiss watch, if you get this Hamilton watch, if you get this, and if you go do this, and you go this with your friends, and oh, it'll feed your soul and it'll fill you, and you'll feel so much better if you. Back in this book, he quotes, see if I can get to it. There it is. Facebook co-founder Sean Parker admitted in an infamous 2017 interview that the thought process behind Facebook was this, in quotes. Here's what he said in quotes. How do we consume as much of your time and conscious attention as possible? And that means that we need to sort of give you a little dopamine hit every once in a while because someone liked or commented on a photo or post or whatever. Now, I'm not preaching against Facebook, and I'm not preaching against the iPhone or whatever you might have. That's not my message. My thought is, though, in this iLife, there's some fake news saying that this is going to fill our life if we stop at a stop sign and we stop at a light and we get distracted or we get to silence and we don't know what to do with it. And so what we do is we fill it with more of this. And my encouragement is to say, no, wait. What if instead of filling it with more of this, and some of the toxic things and the Balaam things that are getting thrown our way, what if instead we begin to fill it with more of Jesus? Rob's playing this song. I love this song. Turn your eyes upon Jesus. That's really my encouragement today. That whether you're watching online and you've been tempted for 300 times during the message to swipe away and look at something else, or you've been here and you've been wanting to pick up your phone and you felt it buzz, and we have this kind of frenetic pace that's going on, and I want to kind of push pause, because here's what God says. He says, be still and know that I'm God. God meets with us in those still moments. And if all of those still moments get caught up in our frenetic pace and picking up this, that, and the other thing, and running, and I'm preaching to myself, believe me, won't we miss out on God? Won't we miss out on digesting who God is and what God's doing in this moment? Won't we miss out on the relationships that God's designed for us? Won't we miss out on the maturity that God really wants for us? No one's ever going to say in 10 years, man, I am so glad I spent so much time on Facebook for the last 10 years. No one's ever going to say that. Think about it. Will you? There's no way. Because a lot of the stuff that we're involved in won't lead to maturity. And so I'm not saying throw your phone away. I'm not saying that. I remember when I was younger, it was, hey, stop watching TV for a week, and you'd stop for 2 days, and then you'd start to twitch, and I need just a hit, and I'm not saying all that. But can we turn our eyes to Jesus? Like, when you pick it up and you feel this impulse and you're like, oh, I got to get a dopamine hit. What if you'd go to the Bible app and start to look at what Jesus has for you today? Read just one verse instead of when you go to bed, instead of saying, okay, who's on Facebook, who's on Instagram, and what's going on over here? Stop and say, God, what do you have for me? And let me just pray before I go to bed. And when you get up, instead of checking to see who's doing what, we just stop. And I'm just going to read the verse of the day before my feet hit the ground. That's my encouragement. So my question as we leave, one reflection question. What does a digital diet look like for you? What does a digital diet look like for you? Let's pray. Oh, Lord, help us to turn our eyes on you, to look fully in your face, so that the things of this earth, all the things that are vying for our attention and drawing us away from you, will just fade in comparison to you. God, we'll give you the praise because only you can do that in our hearts. Only you can do that in our minds. We can't. Lord, we're so helpless even within this. So God, give us the strength and grace, the power to stand up, to do what you've called us to do, to walk with you. In Jesus' name I pray.